There was something different about Robert. It wasn't just the way he walked, always calm, as if he carried an entire world inside him. It wasn't only how he looked people in the eye during confession, or how he held the hands of the sick without hesitation, without fear, as if his touch whispered, "I'm here with you." It was more than that. It was the whole of him, the balance between faith and compassion, strength and gentleness. Father Robert was 38, but many swore his soul was born old-like, someone who had come into the world already knowing he had a greater purpose. His parish wasn't large, but it was always full. People traveled from distant neighborhoods just to hear him preach. His sermons weren't rehearsed or technical. They were lived. Every word felt pulled from his own flesh. He spoke about pain to those who were hurting, about hope to those who had lost it, and about God, with a closeness that moved even the faithless. Widows, teenagers, hardened workers, wounded women, lost children, they all saw him as something familiar, a father, a brother, a friend. Robert never placed himself above anyone. He didn't hide behind his title. He was just Robert, human, present. But even the strongest fall. It was a morning like any other when his body began to fail. First, a relentless fatigue. Then, night sweats, bruises appearing out of nowhere, dizziness, and finally, a fainting spell right, there at the altar, in the middle of Sunday Mass, a packed church, silent panic. And his fall, slow, like time itself was trying to catch his head before it hit the sacred ground. They rushed him to the nearest hospital. He resisted at first, insisting he was just tired. But when the doctor looked into his eyes after the tests, Robert knew. That look, that silence, filled with dread. He'd seen it in many others. Now, it was his own. "Father Robert," the doctor began, his voice soft, "we have a diagnosis." It was like the world was swallowed by fog. The word leukemia hit like a hammer. A rare type, aggressive, relentless. Treatment would be difficult. And if there was to be any real chance at survival, he'd need a bone marrow transplant, urgently. Robert's first reaction was silence, then prayer. In the hospital chapel, he knelt before the crucifix not to beg for salvation, but to seek understanding. "If this is my time, Lord, then let your will be done. But if there is still something you want from me, then let that also be done. I surrender." But the biggest obstacle was his blood. Robert's blood type AB negative was extremely rare. Hardly any donors, almost no matches in the National Registry. His family was small, and no one was compatible. The doctors, though professional, were clear. Without a donor, he had maybe a few months left, if that. The following weeks were filled with tests, IVs, injections, exhaustion. Even in his weakness, Robert still smiled. He prayed with other patients, offered comfort to the nurses, spoke of God's love with veins sore from needles and eyes dimmed by fatigue. He remained a light even in the darkest of places. And then she appeared. Maria Clara was new to the hematology ward, a temporary nurse transferred from a southern hospital. She was 26, with dark hair always pulled into a messy bun and eyes that held both strength and sorrow. She carried herself like someone who had known pain but chose to believe in goodness anyway. Her first encounter with Robert wasn't dramatic. It wasn't love at first sight. It was just respectful. She walked into his room with the chart in hand and said with a steady voice, "Good morning, Father Robert. I'm Maria Clara. I'll be assisting with your treatment." He smiled, pale but still radiant. "God bless you, my child." And with that, a seed was planted. She cared for him with special attention. She was professional, discreet, but there was something in her small gestures that showed more than duty, a blanket tucked with care. Soup served a little warmer than usual, a whispered word when the chemo pain became unbearable. During long nights, when the hospital wing fell into deep silence, Maria Clara would sit by his bed for a few moments. They didn't talk much. Sometimes, They didn't speak at all. But there was something between them, a thread, unseen, as if their souls had already met somewhere, sometime. Days turned into weeks. Robert's condition worsened. The treatment was brutal. His body weakened. The fever wouldn't break. The doctors said little, but Maria Clara could see the fear in their eyes, fear that his time was running out. And then, a miracle. The bone marrow campaign had expanded across hospitals nationwide. Hundreds tested, no matches, until, on a rainy day, the hematology office phone rang. It was the central lab. We found a match. Maria Clara, who was helping file the reports, took the paper to hand it off to the attending doctor. But when she saw the ID number, her breath caught. It was hers. She was the match. For a moment, the floor vanished beneath her feet. She sat down, took a deep breath, read it again, confirmed, then wept. That same afternoon, she walked to room 217. Robert was reading the Psalms, as he did every morning. She stepped inside quietly, her eyes still wet. "Father." "Yes?" "They found a donor. A match for your transplant." His eyes lit up. Hope flickered. He nearly dropped to his knees. "Thank God. Who is it? A parishioner? A young man?" She took a deep breath. "It's me." Silence. He stared at her, wanted to speak, but no words came. He simply reached out and took her hand, not as a priest to a nurse, but as a man thanking a woman who had just given him back his life. "Why?" he asked, his voice shaking. "Because God called me, and I listened." The surgery was scheduled just days later. Robert was weak, but still eligible. Maria Clara signed the forms, faced the pain of the recovery without a single complaint. It was as if she had been given a sacred mission, and she embraced it with everything she had. On the morning of the procedure, she visited him one last time. She knew she wouldn't be allowed to see him after the operation. She needed to say goodbye. "Father, I'll be fine, and so will you." He smiled. "God sent you to me. I'll never forget that." She hesitated, then took his hand and placed it over her heart. "Promise me one thing, anything, that you'll never deny what comes from this second chance." Robert didn't fully understand her words, but he felt the weight of them, and he made his vow. "Never. I promise. With all my heart." They looked at each other one last time. And then, together, they entered the operating rooms each, carrying more than just blood in their veins. They carried destiny. His body was healing, but his heart was aching in a way he had never known. Father Robert was alive. Beating leukemia wasn't just a medical victory, it was a miracle. That's what everyone around him said. Doctors, nurses, parishioners, neighbors. Even those who barely believed in God started to reconsider after seeing such an incredible recovery. But only Robert knew the full truth. His life had been returned to him by a woman, Maria Clara. After the transplant, the days felt longer. His body was responding well, but the doctors insisted on partial isolation. His immune system was still fragile. He couldn't go back to his routine just yet. He needed rest, care, and most of all, he needed to accept help. That was when Maria Clara started to return. Not as a nurse her rotation in the hematology unit had ended, but as a friend. Discreet, gentle. She brought books, warm tea, home-cooked meals. She'd sit by his bed, sometimes just looking out the window in silence. They didn't say much, but they felt everything. Robert tried to resist. He repeated prayers in his mind, recited psalms, meditated on holy texts. But every time she got close, it was as if his soul forgot he wore a collar. Maria Clara didn't ask for anything. She didn't flirt, didn't cross any lines, and that was what broke him. She was light, and he was tired of living in the shadows of denial. One cloudy morning, while a thin drizzle tapped against the hospital window, she came in carrying a bowl of soup. She set it on the tray and sat down. Robert, propped up by pillows, watched her quietly. "Feeling better today?" she asked without looking at him. "The body, yes. The soul, not so much." She turned toward him. "Your soul still hurts?" "More than before." "Before? I was afraid to die. Now, I'm afraid to live with something I'm not allowed to want." Silence stretched between them. She lowered her head. "I should go," she whispered. "I should ask you to leave," he replied just as softly. "But I can't." She stood up, nervous, walked to the window, took a deep breath. The rain was getting heavier. "Why would God bring us together like this, Father?" "Don't call me Father right now," he said, louder than he meant to. She turned, surprised. "Then what should I call you?" He looked into her eyes, as if stepping off a cliff. "Call me Robert." And in that moment, through that name and the surrender it carried, everything began. From that day on, the hospital became the stage for a secret love story. There were no hallway kisses, no public hand-holding. Everything was quiet, hidden, but intense. Every gesture held a weight only they could understand. Maria Clara brought coffee and smiles. Robert offered conversation and reflection. She spoke of a hard childhood, of the siblings she raised alone. He confessed the doubts he'd carried long before the illness. Together, they were simply two people trying not to fall in love and failing. One rainy afternoon, the kind you'd expect in a dramatic soap opera, Robert asked her to come early. He had a mild fever but didn't want medicine. "Stay with me, just for a while," he asked, voice weak. She sat beside his bed. He took her hand cold, small, determined. "If I weren't a priest," he began. "But you are." She cut in firm. "But if I weren't," she touched his lips with her fingers. "Don't tell me what you do. Show me what you feel." And he kissed her. It was a long kiss, tender, full of everything they weren't supposed to feel. Tears mixed with it. It wasn't passion. It was love. Love born in a hospital room between IV bags, bandages, and sacred promises. A love that shouldn't exist, but did. After that day, there was no turning back. In the hallways, they pretended indifference, but in their eyes, there was fire. He lived for those stolen moments when they were alone. When she couldn't visit, his soul wilted. When she smiled, he felt guilt. When she cried, he felt like he was losing everything. The conflict was inevitable. "This won't last, Robert," she said one night as the rain fell outside. "I know. One day, you'll go back to the church, to your collar, and this will be over." He didn't respond. He simply rested his forehead against hers. "I don't want it to be over," she cried. The following week, Maria Clara was offered a new job in another hospital. A promotion, better pay, more stability. She didn't want to leave, but she knew she had to. On the night before her departure, she went to his room one last time. "I won't be able to see you tomorrow," she said, her eyes red. "So, I came to say goodbye." Robert took her hand, as he always did. "Maria Clara, She placed something in his hand. An envelope. "It's better if you read this later. Alone. And don't come looking for me." "Why?" "Because you were meant for something greater. And what happened between us was just a miracle." She kissed his forehead and left. Didn't look back. Robert waited. When he felt the hallway was silent, he opened the envelope. A letter. Simple. Handwritten. "Robert, I don't want promises. I don't want regrets. I just want you to know that these days with you were the best of my life. But I can't keep you. You're a man of God. And what we had was a moment out of time. I love you. And I always will. But now, it's time to let go. Maria Clara." He cried like he'd never cried before. He lay down, holding the pillow that still smelled like her. And there, alone in the dark, he made a vow to heaven. "If she ever calls for me, I'll go. No matter who I am, no matter where I am, I'll go." He had no idea that day would come. And with it, a secret too big to hide. The envelope still lay on the desk. Its edges were creased, his name handwritten across the front. Sometimes Robert would stare at that handwriting as if it were a mirror reflecting sweet sins. He had read the letter dozens of times, yet every time he read it again, something inside him ached in a new way. A child. His child. The thought haunted him like a whisper he couldn't shake. During Mass, while counseling parishioners, even in silent prayer before the altar, it was impossible to escape. He'd wake in the middle of the night, imagining the child's face. Was it a boy or a girl? Would the child have Maria Clara's dark eyes? His smile? Was it born healthy? Walking by now? Talking? Doubt and guilt twisted inside him like a knot that wouldn't come undone. Robert wasn't just a priest. He was a man. And now, more than ever, he felt torn between two callings, one to God and one to the life he had helped create. For weeks, he carried that torment in silence. He avoided looking toward heaven in anger, but the questions remained. Lord, why give me this love if I could never have it? Why let a child be born from a miracle if I'm not allowed to call them mine? His sermons became shorter, his eyes more tired, his voice less steady. His colleagues noticed, but no one dared ask. The parish still adored their priest, unaware of the storm raging behind that calm face. Then, one morning in January, Maria Clara arrived. No warning, no announcement. She just appeared. That same steady gaze, that same gentle face, now lit with a new glow. She was different, more woman, stronger, more certain. Robert was tending the small parish garden, digging into the soil, trying to keep his mind busy. When he saw her, he froze. Time seemed to stop. Maria Clara, he whispered, barely able to speak. She smiled softly and placed her hands over her belly. It's a boy, Robert. He dropped the spade, walked toward her slowly, as if stepping on sacred ground. When is he due? He's already here, 2 days old. His name is Pedro. Robert felt his knees buckle. She held him steady. He's healthy. Perfect. A miracle, just like I told you he'd be. I don't even know what to say. You don't have to say anything. She took a deep breath and looked into his eyes. Robert, I didn't come here to ask for anything. I'm not here to pull you away from your mission or your calling. I just needed you to know that he exists, that he's yours, that he was created with love, and that despite everything, I want you to continue. He didn't understand right away. Continue. As a priest, as a man of God, as the man who inspires so many. What happened between us may have been a detour from your destiny, but it was also a gift. I don't want to be your fall. I want to be your strength. Robert's tears welled up. She stepped closer, took his hand, and placed a small envelope in his palm. There's a photo of him inside. I just want you to see him, to know he's real, and to never, ever deny what came from us. Maria Clara, She squeezed his hand, cutting him off. I don't need you to claim him. Not now. Maybe not ever. But I want one thing from you. He looked into her eyes, his own filled with tears. Anything. Promise me that even if the whole world demands your silence, you will never deny me, and never deny Pedro, not even in your thoughts. Robert dropped to his knees in front of her, as if kneeling before the altar itself. He held her hands like holy relics. I promise, before God, that I will never deny what we had, that I will never deny this child, and that somehow I will care for him, even from a distance, in silence. But I'll be there. Always. Maria Clara wept. He wept. And in that simple parish garden, the two sealed the deepest vow a forbidden love could make. She didn't stay. She left that same afternoon, said she had to protect the baby from exposure, that she would continue with her life, and that she trusted him. Robert placed the photo of Pedro inside the cover of his Bible. Every morning before Mass, he looked at that little face, so small, so innocent, and made the same prayer. Lord, protect him, and give me strength to keep my promise. That day, Robert ceased to be just a priest. He became a father, a secret father, a hidden father, but a father nonetheless. 10 years, like a breath. The world had changed, wars had begun, governments had fallen, the faith of millions shaken by scandals, poverty, and pain. But from all that chaos, new hope had also risen. A new generation, a new moment, a new promise. And it was during this time of darkness and expectation that the world met a new pope. Robert, now 50 years old, was elected Pope Leo XIV, the youngest pontiff in modern history. An American, soft-spoken, steady-eyed, His rise was celebrated across the globe as a clear sign of renewal. He was a spiritual leader, yes, but also a man of action, compassion, and truth. The cardinals chose him with rare unanimity, not just for his theological knowledge, but for his soul. Robert was different. He had a light that couldn't be taught in seminaries. He was someone who had known pain, love, and loss, and still chose to love the world with his whole heart. The world needed peace, and he brought it. In the first year of his papacy, he helped broker a historic ceasefire between two nations locked in decades of hatred. He gathered religious leaders in Jerusalem, and, hand in hand with Muslims, Jews, Christians, and even atheists, he asked for silence, and then he prayed. In multiple languages, with tears in his eyes, he spoke of love like someone who had felt it deeply, of forgiveness like someone who had needed it, and of faith like someone who had once questioned it and stayed. The press called him the People's Pope. Others said, he is what the world needed. Some dared more, he is the greatest pope in history. In St. Peter's Square, crowds gathered not just to see him, but to hear him. Children ran to him. Young people said he helped them believe again. The elderly wept during his speeches, as if finally hearing something they'd waited for their whole lives. But only he knew what he hid beneath the white robes and serene smile. A secret, a boy, a vow. Pedro, the child born from a miracle, from a brief and forbidden love. Robert had never claimed him publicly. He couldn't. The world, the church, the sacred vows, all of it stood in the way. But he had never forgotten, and he had never broken his promise. Pedro grew up far from the eyes of the press, the Vatican, and the corridors of power. He lived with Maria Clara, now in another city, with a simple name and a quiet life. But he had everything he needed: love, education, safety, and a father watching from afar. Yes, because Robert, even from a distance, cared for him. He sent support discreetly, oversaw the boy's education through anonymous means. He knew his grades, his checkups, his birthdays. And every year on the same day, he received a letter from Maria Clara with a drawing made by Pedro, who didn't yet know the truth. Not yet. In the privacy of his Vatican quarters, Robert kept a small wooden box. Inside were all the letters, all the drawings, a tiny blue pacifier, a lock of hair tied with white ribbon, and the first photo Maria Clara gave him when Pedro was born. It was his secret altar, his private Calvary, and, at the same time, his only redemption. At night, when silence blanketed the domes of Rome, Robert would open that box and cry. Sometimes he prayed. Other times, he just stared into the boy's eyes in the photo and whispered apologies for not being the father he longed to be. By day, he was the Pope, spiritual leader of billions, a voice against injustice, a refuge for the broken. By night, he was simply Robert, a man torn between duty and love. Surrounded by cardinals, aides, and security, no one ever suspected a thing. He was discreet, methodical. He spoke of personal matters only with God, never with men. But the weight in his heart grew heavier. With every global victory, with every honor bestowed, the unease inside him deepened, because Pedro was growing, and time, he knew, would wait for no one. Arrived, wrapped in silence. There was no seal, no signature, only his name, Robert, written in a trembling hand that he hadn't seen in years but would recognize in any lifetime. The moment he saw it, his heart tightened. It had been almost a decade since he had last seen her face. A decade since that garden, that vow, that goodbye. Now, in the stillness of his private study at the Vatican, Pope Leo XVI, spiritual leader of the world, read the words of the only woman who had ever touched his soul deeper than faith itself. Robert, forgive me for reaching out this way. I wouldn't dare disturb your path if it weren't for something much bigger than me. I'm sick. Very sick. The doctors say it's terminal. I've made peace with that. But before I go, I must see you one last time. Please, if there's still anything left of the promise you once made, let me see you. Maria Clara. He read it again, then again. His hands shook. The world saw him as a symbol of peace, strength, and unwavering faith. But right now, Robert felt none of those things. He felt like a man, a father, a lover who had never stopped loving. He arranged for the meeting in secret. Under the cover of darkness, without the knowledge of his advisors, she was brought quietly into the Vatican through a side entrance rarely used, an ancient stone corridor that led beneath the apostolic palace. When he saw her, his breath caught. She was thin, fragile, her skin pale and translucent. The brightness in her eyes had dimmed, replaced by something deeper, serenity and farewell. He didn't say a word, just walked to her and wrapped his arms around her as gently as if she might break. "You look the same," she whispered. "And you look like an angel," he replied, his voice cracking. They sat together in a small chapel, the same one where generations of popes had prayed alone. Candles flickered in silence, casting golden light on her face. "How long?" he asked softly. "Weeks, maybe days." He lowered his head. "I'm so sorry." She took his hand. "Don't be. I've had a beautiful life. I have Pedro." At the sound of the name, Robert looked away. His throat closed up. "He's 10 now," she continued. "So smart, so kind. He plays the violin, would you believe it?" A tear slid down Robert's cheek. He laughed through it. "He's already more holy than me." They sat in silence for a moment longer. Then Maria Clara's voice changed. It became firmer. He recognized that tone. The same one she had used when she asked him 10 years ago to follow his path. "Robert, I came to ask you for something. My last request." He held her gaze. "Anything." She breathed deeply. "I want you to acknowledge Pedro. Publicly. I want the world to know he exists, and that he is your son." The words hit him like thunder. For a moment, all sound disappeared. Even the breath in his lungs stopped. "Maria Clara, I know what I'm asking," she said calmly. "I know what it means. If I do that, I may lose everything. I'm not asking you to be a father in secret anymore, Robert. He deserves to know who he is. The world deserves to know who you are." He stood, pacing, hands trembling. "You asked me once to keep walking my path, to continue my mission. And you did. You changed the world. But now I ask you to honor your promise." He turned to face her, eyes burning. "I made a vow to God. You made one to me too." And there it was. The collision he had feared all these years. The sacred oath he had sworn to the church. And the sacred promise he had sworn to her. They stood in opposite corners of his soul. Maria Clara stood slowly, despite her weakness. She walked toward him and placed her hand over his heart. "You've brought peace to nations, saved lives, moved hearts. But if you can't love your own son openly, what peace is left inside of you?" He closed his eyes. One tear fell, then another. "If I do this, I may be forced to step down." "Then do it. Show the world what love looks like." He opened his eyes. She was fading before him, but her strength filled the room. He pulled her close, rested his forehead on hers. "I'm scared." "I know." They stayed that way, locked in silence, 2 lives forever changed by one forbidden love and one miraculous child. That night, after she had gone, Robert remained in the chapel until dawn. Alone, weeping, praying, torn between 2 altars. He had no answers. Only a question echoing louder with every heartbeat. Was the cost of truth too high, or had he already paid it by staying silent? Walls had seen centuries of secrets. Whispers in corridors, confessions behind marble doors, oaths made beneath frescoed ceilings. But some secrets refused to stay buried even within the most sacred of places. For weeks, something had been stirring beneath the surface. Whispers grew louder, movements more carefully watched. And one man in particular, Monsignor Carlo Benedetti, a high-ranking advisor in the Vatican Secretariat, had begun to notice things that didn't quite add up. Late-night movements, unscheduled visitors, private chapel meetings that weren't logged, documents locked away in drawers that were once always open. Carlo had served 3 popes. He was sharp, loyal to the institution, and deeply traditional. And though he respected Pope Leo XIV, something about the Pope's recent demeanor troubled him. The serenity on Robert's face had turned into heaviness. His sermons were still powerful, but his gaze often wandered. And late at night, Carlo noticed that the Pope's private quarters remained lit for hours. So, he began to dig. Quietly, he reviewed the entry records from the Apostolic Palace, checked the surveillance from lesser-used corridors, compared schedules and room activity. What he found was vague, incomplete, but suggestive. One name kept appearing in obscure, restricted logs: Maria Clara. He didn't know who she was, yet. But the Pope's staff was instructed never to speak of her, and that silence was confirmation enough. Carlo's mind raced. Could the Holy Father? No, impossible. But still, the evidence was mounting, and the implications were unthinkable. He brought it to the only person he trusted above himself, Cardinal Matteo Visconti. Matteo was old, nearing 80, a man who had mentored Robert when he was still a young seminarian, wise, calm, deeply spiritual. His voice was slow and his eyes kind, but they missed nothing. Carlo requested a private audience and laid out his findings with the care of someone dismantling a bomb. When Matteo heard the name Maria Clara, he didn't flinch. But when Carlo suggested the Pope may have fathered a child with Harry's eyes closed, he exhaled, slowly, and then asked, quietly, "Leave us." Once alone, Matteo reached for his cane and walked slowly toward the grand window overlooking the gardens of the Vatican. Moments later, he summoned Robert. The Pope arrived, solemn, already knowing what this was about. He had felt the net tightening. He had sensed it in the air, the kind of tension that only happens when truth presses too hard against silence. When he entered, the old cardinal didn't turn. He kept his eyes on the trees, swaying in the distance. "Is it true?" he asked. Robert didn't answer. "Is it true that you loved a woman and that you have a child?" Silence again. Then, softly, "Yes." Matteo closed his eyes, as if the answer drained what little strength he had left. "Why, Robert? Because I was human, because I was dying, and because she saved my life." Matteo turned now, walked closer, looked into Robert's eyes. "And the boy? His name is Pedro. He's 10. He doesn't know I'm his father, but I've watched over him all his life, silently, faithfully." The old cardinal sighed, sat down. His hands trembled as he folded them. "You know what this could do, don't you?" "Yes." "It could destroy your legacy, shake the faith of millions, undo everything you've worked for. And yet, how do I pretend he doesn't exist?" The room was quiet for a long time. Then, Matteo spoke, and his voice was no longer that of a friend but of the church itself. "You must not tell anyone. Not now." Robert's heart sank. He deserves to be known, to be loved openly. "And what of the church? The wars you've stopped? The unity you've built? Will you trade all that for one boy?" Robert clenched his fists. "He's not just any boy. He's my son." Matteo looked away, pained. "Robert, this is bigger than you, bigger than any of us. We must think of the world. The church needs you on the throne. It needs Leo XIV, not Robert, the father." Robert said nothing. But inside, something cracked. A wall that had held back guilt and pain for years gave way. He left the room without another word, walked slowly through the halls of the Vatican, the same halls where paintings of popes long gone stared down at him with eyes of duty and judgment. He returned to his chambers, opened the wooden box once more. Pedro's drawings, his photo, the letters, all still there. He held them to his chest, closed his eyes. He had always known that being pope would demand sacrifice. But now, he was starting to wonder if that sacrifice had become too high, and whether, in saving the world, he had slowly lost himself. Lit only by the soft flicker of a single candle. Outside, the world continued unaware, cars moving, phones ringing, prayers whispered in distant corners of Rome. But inside this hospice room, time had stopped, and so had breath. Maria Clara was dying. Her body, once full of quiet strength, was now fragile, hollowed by illness. The doctors had done all they could. Now, it was only a matter of hours. But she had waited for him, and he had come. Pope Leo XIV, Robert sat beside her bed. No vestments, no staff, no guards. Just a man, holding the hand of the only woman who ever truly knew him. Their fingers were intertwined, trembling with memory, love, and goodbye. She opened her eyes slowly. Even in that final moment, she smiled. "You kept your promise," she whispered. "Of course I did," he replied, fighting back the tears. "I always will." Her breathing was shallow, but her voice remained steady, miraculously strong, even as her body failed. "Did you think I would leave this world without seeing your face again?" Robert shook his head. "I was afraid you wouldn't want to see mine." She squeezed his hand, faint but firm. "You've become everything I always knew you could be. You've saved so many, Robert. The world loves you, but he still doesn't know." Robert lowered his head, unable to meet her eyes. "I'm afraid, Maria Clara." "I know," she said gently, "but you're his father. He deserves to know the truth, even if the world doesn't." A pause. Then, "There's a letter. I wrote it for him. For when I'm gone, he'll find it. And when he does, he'll come looking for you." Robert's throat tightened. "And when he does, what do I tell him?" She smiled again, her last smile. "You'll know." A tear rolled down her cheek. "Promise me one last thing. Anything. Don't let him grow up thinking he was a mistake. He was our miracle." Robert leaned down, kissed her forehead. "He'll know, I swear it." And then, without drama, without sound, Maria Clara left this world, eyes closed, hand in his, heart at peace. He stayed there for hours. No bells rang, no headlines blared. Just silence and mourning. The next day, in a small house far from Vatican walls, a 10-year-old boy named Pedro sat on his bed holding an envelope. His mother had left it for him. Her handwriting on the front, addressed simply, "For Pedro, when the time is right." His hands trembled as he opened it. Inside, a letter written in her soft, steady voice. "My son, if you are reading this, I'm no longer with you. But I'm not far. I'm in the music you play, the dreams you chase, the kindness in your heart. There is something you must know. Your father is not just anyone. He is a good man, a great man. He is Pope Leo XIV. He is the man the world calls Holy Father. And though he could never say it aloud, he has loved you from the very beginning. He watched your first steps from afar. He cried over your drawings. He prayed for you every night. You were not an accident. You were born of love. Now it is time for you to find him, not as the Pope, but as your father, and give him the chance to choose." Pedro sat frozen, the letter shaking in his hands. He didn't cry, not yet. He just stared out the window, watching the clouds drift by, and whispered one word to the wind: "Father." Meanwhile, back in the Vatican, Robert sat alone in his private chamber. Maria Clara was gone. Pedro now knew, and the weight of the world felt heavier than ever. He stood at the window, looking out at the square where crowds still gathered to see him, unaware that the man behind the glass was breaking. He had delayed too long, and now the moment had come. He would have to decide: tell the truth and risk everything, or stay silent and lose what mattered most. He pressed his hand to the cold glass and whispered to himself, "What kind of father saves the world and loses his own son?" Fire again. A violent conflict had erupted between two major powers nations already on edge from years of mistrust, sanctions, and provocations. Missiles had fallen. Civilians were fleeing. The global community watched in horror as diplomacy collapsed in real time. And once again, all eyes turned to one man. Pope Leo XIV, the man of peace, the bridge between enemies, the voice that could silence guns and bring leaders to the table. He had done it before. And now, The world needed him again. Robert received the call in the middle of the night. His advisors entered the papal chambers with urgent faces and trembling hands. "Your Holiness, they're asking for you, both sides." He closed his eyes, nodded slowly. There was no time to rest, no room for hesitation. The Vatican began preparing immediately. A summit was arranged in neutral territory. Cameras, planes, security all mobilized. The entire planet would be watching. But just as the Church began to orchestrate its greatest diplomatic intervention of the century, another storm broke loose. And this time, it was personal. A journalist from an obscure outlet published an article online, citing anonymous Vatican sources and claiming that the Pope had fathered a child in secret. The story was vague, no proof, only whispers, but it had enough bite to spread like wildfire. Within hours, major news outlets picked it up. Headlines screamed across televisions and phones. "Does the Pope have a secret son?" Leaked sources hint at hidden child of Leo XIV. Moral crisis at the Vatican? Robert's name was everywhere, not as a mediator of peace, but as the center of a scandal. Inside the Vatican, chaos erupted. The Secretary of State summoned an emergency meeting with the College of Cardinals. Tensions ran high. Arguments erupted behind closed doors. The Church had survived many crises, but this, coming at the brink of war, threatened to unravel everything. They called Robert in. He entered the grand hall in silence, robes flowing, face calm but pale. His presence demanded respect, but even that couldn't silence the urgency in the room. Cardinals rose one after another. "This cannot be true, Your Holiness. The timing is catastrophic. Deny it immediately. The world needs you intact. The Church cannot afford this." Finally, the Secretary of State spoke with icy precision. "Your Holiness, for the sake of peace and for the reputation of this institution, we urge you to issue a formal denial. A simple statement. Nothing more. This story will vanish. But if you hesitate, we may lose control." Robert remained quiet for a long moment. His heart pounded not from fear, but from grief. He thought of Pedro, of Maria Clara's final request, of the promise he had made on his knees. And now, here it was the decision. Deny the truth, and keep the peace. Or speak it, and risk everything. He looked around the room, at the men in red robes, at the centuries of marble, tradition, and silence. And then he spoke softly, but with a weight that cut through the tension like thunder. "What if it's true?" Gasps. Chairs shifted, papers rustled. A few cardinals turned their heads, unable to look him in the eye. "What if I do have a son?" he continued. "What if I've been a father in secret, all these years, not out of shame, but to protect him from this exact moment?" The room was frozen. "You say the Church will fall, that the world will burn if they know the Pope once loved. That peace depends on a lie. But how can we speak of love, of truth, of justice, if I am forced to deny my own blood?" Silence. Only the sound of his breathing, and somewhere in the distance, the ticking of a clock. One voice rose from the shadows. Cardinal Matteo Visconti. His mentor. Older now. Weaker, but still wise. "If you do this, Robert, you will lose the papacy. They will force your hand." Robert nodded. "Then let them." The room erupted in protest. Voices clashed. But Robert stood unmoved. He knew the time for hiding was over. He had been Pope long enough. Now, he would be a father. For a resignation that never came. Despite mounting pressure, public speculation, and internal unrest, Pope Leo XIV did not step down. He did not confirm the rumors, but he also refused to deny them. Instead, he made a quiet decision, one that tore at his soul, but protected everything he loved. Pedro would remain hidden but under his protection. Robert arranged for the boy to be transferred to a discreet religious boarding school just outside Rome. The staff were sworn to secrecy. The Vatican quietly financed everything. Pedro was watched over, guarded, and cared for. From afar, but fully. It wasn't the life he deserved, but it was the only way to keep him safe. The boy was told little, only that he had to stay hidden for a while, that the world was complicated, that some truths needed time, But Pedro wasn't a child anymore. He was 10 years old and he was beginning to understand what it meant to be invisible. He saw the news. He read the rumors. He saw the Pope's face everywhere. And when he looked in the mirror, he saw the same eyes. The silence hurt more than words. He felt like a secret, a mistake, a shadow. Then one night, he couldn't take it anymore. Without telling anyone, Pedro packed a small backpack with clothes, some coins, and the letter his mother had left him. And just before dawn, he slipped out of the dormitory and disappeared into the streets of Rome. The school panicked. Vatican security was alerted immediately. But they couldn't go public, not without exposing everything. Robert was in the middle of a high-level meeting when the news was whispered in his ear. He's gone. For a moment, the world blurred. The voices in the room became muffled. His heart dropped into silence. He stood, quietly, and said only, "Cancel everything." That night, for the first time in his papacy, Pope Leo XIV left the Vatican in secret. No robes, no entourage, no protocol. Just Robert, a man, a father, searching the city for the son he had only known from a distance. He wandered through alleyways, hospitals, police stations, asking, watching, praying. He thought of Maria Clara, of her last breath, her last wish. He couldn't lose Pedro. Not now. Not after everything. Meanwhile, the boy wandered the streets alone, cold, confused, angry. He walked past homeless men, neon signs, barking dogs. He clutched the letter against his chest like armor. Eventually, his feet gave out near the Tiber River. He sat beneath a bridge, shivering, crying silently. And then he felt a hand on his shoulder. Pedro flinched, turned, and saw him. Not the Pope. Not the holy man in white. Just Robert, eyes full of tears, kneeling before him. "Pedro," he said, voice shaking. "It's me. I'm here." The boy stared at him, searching for something real, something true. "Are you really my father?" Robert nodded, his throat tight. "I should have told you sooner. I should have held you in my arms from the start. I was wrong. But I've loved you every day of your life." Pedro didn't answer. He looked away. "Why didn't you say it? Why didn't you ever tell the world?" Robert couldn't lie. "Because I was afraid. Because I was weak. Because I thought hiding you would keep you safe. But all it did was hurt you." A long silence. Then Pedro whispered, "I don't want to be your secret anymore." Robert pulled him close, wrapped him in his arms. "You won't be. Not anymore." They stayed like that for a long time. Father and son, alone in the night, under a Roman bridge, two hearts finally beating in the same rhythm. From the shadows. Neither Robert nor Pedro noticed it at first, not as they embraced beneath the bridge, father and son reunited in a moment that was supposed to be only theirs. But a journalist had followed the whispers, a freelancer who had been staking out the Vatican for days, hoping for a lead on the Pope's mysterious absence. He hadn't expected much, until he saw the familiar figure, dressed plainly, walking the streets of Rome like a man with nothing left to lose. He followed him, watched him kneel by the river, and then, with shaking hands, took the photo that would change the world. The image hit the internet at dawn. Breaking, Pope Leo XIV found embracing child beneath Rome Bridge. Sources claim boy is his secret son. Is this the end of the people's pope? By mid-morning, the story had eclipsed everything else: war, politics, entertainment. Every screen on every continent was filled with the same photograph, the most beloved pope in modern history, holding a child, his face raw with emotion. The Vatican tried to contain the explosion. Press teams scrambled. Spokesmen issued vague statements. The Curia convened an emergency session. But it was too late. The world had seen. And the world reacted. Some cried, "He's human. He's a father. He deserves forgiveness." Others burned. "He lied. He broke his vows. He must step down." Headlines collided across ideological lines. Social media erupted. News anchors cried on air. Protesters gathered outside the Vatican, some with signs of support, others with demands for resignation. Cardinals were divided. Nations were divided. Even families at breakfast tables argued over the man they thought they knew. Inside the apostolic palace, Robert stood at the window with Pedro at his side. The boy held his hand, confused, frightened, but no longer alone. "They hate you now," he said quietly. Robert shook his head. "Not all of them. Are you going to quit being pope?" Robert looked down at the square thousands of people already gathering, chanting, praying, shouting. The pressure was immense. Political leaders were calling. Bishops were resigning. Conservative factions threatened to split from Rome. And yet, for the first time in years, he felt free. He looked at Pedro. "I don't know yet, but I won't lie anymore. Not to them, not to you, not to myself." The doors to the press room were already opening. A statement was being prepared. But for now, Robert stayed with his son. They sat in silence as the world watched, waited, judged. The man once known as the greatest pope in history had finally shown his humanity. And that, more than any doctrine or decree, had shaken the church to its core. Held its breath. News anchors across continents fell silent. Streets that were once filled with anger and confusion emptied as screens flickered on. Churches, cafes, classrooms everywhere. People waited. They knew what was coming. But no one was prepared for how it would feel. The balcony of St. Peter's Basilica had seen centuries of declarations. Wars ended, popes crowned, history carved in Latin and stone. But never this. At precisely noon, the great doors opened. Pope Leo XIV stepped forward not in the grandeur of papal robes, but in a simple white cassock, shoulders squared, eyes full of gravity. Beside him was a boy, 10 years old, dark hair, nervous hands. "Pedro." The square erupted in gasps, then silence again. Not a word, not a breath. Robert stepped to the microphone, placed his hand on the boy's shoulder, and looked into the eyes of the world. His voice, when it came, was clear and unwavering. "Brothers and sisters, I come before you not as a pope today, but as a man, a father, a sinner, a servant." The world watched. Millions, billions, every screen, every channel. Years ago, before I wore this white robe, I was dying. And God, in His infinite mercy, gave me life through the kindness of a woman named Maria Clara. He paused, closed his eyes. A tear rolled down. I loved her, silently, secretly, purely. She gave me something I never thought I could have: a son. Another pause. This time, Pedro looked up at him, eyes wide. "This is Pedro, my son, my blood, my miracle." The crowd erupted. Some gasped, others wept. Hands covered mouths, knees buckled. I hid him, not because I was ashamed, but because I was afraid of breaking what this robe represents. But in hiding him, I broke something far more sacred, my own heart. He placed his arm around Pedro, held him close. "Today, I ask the world not for forgiveness, but for understanding. I ask the church not for tolerance, but for truth. I ask God not for mercy, but for courage, for what comes next." Silence once again. He stepped forward. "Therefore, as of this moment, I formally resign the papacy, not out of shame, but out of love. Love for this child, for the woman who gave him life, for the God who asks me to be honest in all things." The square exploded. Shock, tears, applause, anguish, joy, division. Cardinals clutched their chests. Nuns wept. Children watched, not knowing what they were witnessing, but feeling its weight. Robert turned to Pedro. "I was always your father, but now I can finally be one." And for the first time in public view, he knelt down, opened his arms, and hugged his son. A long, trembling, desperate embrace. Not of a pope, not of a leader, but of a man who had waited 10 years to stop pretending he didn't love his own child. The world watched. And in that moment, history bent. Not through doctrine, not through power, but through a single act of radical, public, unconditional love. Not ready. Pope Leo XIV's resignation, the first voluntary step-down of a sitting pope not due to age or illness, but out of love sent shockwaves through every nation, every pulpit, every newsroom. At first, it was disbelief. Then, panic. Within 2 weeks, the fragile ceasefires he had helped maintain across volatile regions began to crumble. Nations that had sat at the same table only because of his presence now pointed missiles and accusations once more. Tensions escalated, borders heated, refugees fled. "Without the Pope, we have no mediator," said one desperate diplomat during an emergency UN session. He was the last thread holding the peace. Global leaders scrambled. Some condemned him, others begged for his return. Markets trembled, church attendance surged. But through it all, Robert remained silent. He had left Rome with nothing but a duffel bag and his son's hand in his. No robes, no entourage. Just a man and a boy trying to become father and son for the first time. They settled in a modest seaside town in southern Italy. No cameras, no press. Just wind, water, and healing. Every morning, Robert walked with Pedro along the shoreline. Every night, they sat by candlelight, reading from Scripture, or drawing with colored pencils on old scraps of paper. It was peace, but the world was burning. And he knew it. So one morning, while Pedro still slept, Robert sat at the edge of the sea with a notebook in his lap. He opened it and wrote 3 words: "The Peace Alliance." What began as a thought turned into a plan. What was once a whisper became a fire. Robert began calling old contacts diplomats, peacekeepers, religious leaders, field workers. They answered. Not because of his title, but because of who he was. In less than a month, the Peace Alliance was born. An international non-religious NGO with one goal: to mediate global conflicts through transparency, compassion, and neutral ground. Robert refused to lead it as a religious figure. He was done with thrones. He led as Robert, the man who had made peace in a white robe, now chose to do the same in sandals and a plain linen shirt. The alliance exploded. In Syria, militias paused their advances to listen to his emissaries. In Eastern Europe, 2 rival leaders agreed to a summit because, if the Pope gave up power for peace, maybe we should too. In South America, mothers named their newborns Pedro and Clara, inspired by the story of love, loss, and courage. The Vatican watched in silence. At first, the cardinals had been furious. He had humiliated them, they thought. He had broken tradition. He had confessed love. He had held a child in front of the world and renounced glory to embrace humanity. But then, they saw something. The world hadn't fallen. It had risen. His resignation had not weakened faith, it had strengthened it. People who had abandoned the church returned, not for doctrine, but for truth. Children dressed as Pedro in school plays. Young priests quoted his speech instead of ancient encyclicals. Even hardened bishops whispered, "We judged him too soon." Then something unprecedented happened. In a private conclavian emergency session held not to elect a new pope, but to discuss the future of the papacy itself, Cardinal Matteo Visconti stood. Old, frail, and with tears in his eyes. "We were wrong," he said. "We saw scandal, but the world saw sacrifice." He paused. "We must ask ourselves, is the papacy a crown or a cross? If it is the latter, then Robert bore it with more honor than any of us ever could." The room fell into stunned silence. Within days, letters poured in. From cardinals, archbishops, heads of state, millions of faithful around the globe. A consensus formed not through decree, but through longing. Robert must return, not to rule, but to guide. But how? He had renounced the throne. He could not be recrowned. No precedent allowed it. Then Matteo proposed the impossible. "We will not reinstate him as pope. We will name him Pope Emeritus, but not in retirement, in rebirth. A new role, a new title, a new chapter. Pope Emeritus and global mediator for peace." He would live outside the Vatican. He would have no political power, no seat of command. But he would be the face of the Church's compassion, courage, and change. It had never been done. It broke 1,000 rules. But in breaking those rules, the church finally caught up with the world it had always tried to serve. They flew to him quietly, without press, in a humble car. Mateo walked onto the beach, found Robert with his sleeves rolled, helping Pedro build a sandcastle. "They're calling for you," the old cardinal said. Robert smiled without looking up. "I already answered the call once. This time, it's not a throne they offer. It's a pulpit, without walls, without chains." Robert stood, looked to the sea, then to his son. "Will I still be allowed to be his father?" "More than that," Mateo whispered. "He will stand beside you, as your son, and as a symbol of who we can be when we stop pretending love is a sin." Robert looked at Pedro. The boy, older now in his eyes, nodded. "Let's go, Dad." 1 month later, the world watched again. St. Peter's Square was full, not for a coronation, not for a mass, but for a moment. Robert walked alone to the balcony. No mitre, no staff, just his son beside him. And the banners that flew no longer read Leo XIV, but Hope Has a Name. The speech was simple. "I return not to lead, but to walk. With you, with him, with the broken, with the outcast, with the forgotten." He gestured to Pedro. "This is my son." The church now welcomes him not as scandal, but as salvation. The crowd erupted. Tears, laughter, hugs between strangers. Even the most cynical journalists admitted they had witnessed a moment of history where humanity and holiness met on equal ground. The Vatican passed new decrees. For the first time, a pope's paternal love was declared not a sin but a virtue, a model of divine imperfection, proof that the sacred is not in flawless celibacy, but in courageous honesty. The church changed. The world shifted. And Robert, no longer hiding, no longer wearing masks, became more powerful in humility than he had ever been in power. Pedro grew beside him, not in shadows, but in the light. Sometimes it is not in holding on to titles that we lead, but in letting go of them. And sometimes the holiest thing a man can do is to love.